Not long ago, I introduced someone named Kevin Sutherland, who's doing really interesting work in large-scale agility in the governmental public service space. So I decided to have him on the show because I think what he's doing and how he approaches it is something that we could all learn from. One of the biggest challenges we face in implementing Agile is doing it at scale in large environments where the number of people, complexity, dependencies can really obstruct the value that we're trying to unlock. And Kevin is out there finding solutions, tweaking things, blowing things up and rebuilding them, all in service of one thing: using Agile to get value to people who, in this case, desperately need it. I think you'll really enjoy this one. Check him out. That's this week on the Badass Agile podcast. Greetings, team. Welcome to the Badass Agile podcast. I'm your host, Chris Williams. Hey, Kevin. How you doing, man?
Hey, good. How are you?
Very good. Thank you for coming. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Awesome. Yeah, it's great. Glad to be here.
Now, first of all, where are you from? Like, where are you at right now? Where am I speaking to you at?
I'm in the Des Moines, Iowa area in a smaller suburb called Ankeny.
Very nice. Well, welcome. I'm just north of Toronto here in Canada. I want some of your background. I have some things to tell my listeners about how I know you or how we got to start talking, but I thought I'd let you go first. Tell me a little bit about your background.
Sure. I started my career with Accenture out in California, implementing these large organizational and system transformations. Actually grew up in Iowa, graduated from Iowa State, and made my way out there because my brother was out there. Long story there. But it was probably the time I started was around the same time the Agile Manifesto was being signed. So at that time, Accenture was still all in on full-out waterfall methodologies. Accenture actually had a proprietary delivery method that everyone was trained on called Accenture Delivery Methodology. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of funny looking back now because you see a lot of these people talking about SAFe and complaining about the structure and complexity. ADM was like thousands of pages of how to explicitly execute a waterfall project. It was really something. And so the first project I was on, we got to see some of the results of that. I was on the implementation support team, which I have a lot of crazy stories about. One of which was we were doing implementation support for staff in the offices that were using the system that we delivered. We arrived at their office and the staff were outside picketing basically us. They had gone to the trouble of making t-shirts, with our system name on it, a big X through it. They were chanting, we hate your system, we won't use it, that kind of thing. I mean, just think of how much you have to hate a computer system to go to that level of trouble, right? And anyway, that's just a story from my earlier days learning about waterfall. But around 2012, Agile approaches had made their way to places like Accenture. So instead of going to this ADM training, we started sending folks to Scrum training. We started selling projects as Agile projects. We sold one of those to the state of Iowa, and I relocated back to Iowa to deliver one of those projects. And looking back at the contract that we were working on, nearly the only thing that was Agile about it was that the customer could change their mind frequently about the 700-page contract, the hundreds of system requirements that all still had to be delivered anyway. And so needless to say, after exhausting the entire schedule and budget of that project, we were about 15% complete. And with the actual contract scope, I ended up making a decision to leave Accenture at that point. Started my own company, Strategic Innovation Consulting, with this mission of bringing better strategy to these state government contexts to improve outcomes for people rather than just focusing on the implementation of systems. And so I've been working more on the state side as an independent consultant to help with this mission. At the same time, I became much more engaged in the Agile community, which offers principles that I think are very aligned to that goal. And I became a consistent listener of this podcast, of the Badass Agile podcast, which I think resonates very strongly with the mission and gave me the encouragement to keep trying to change the world for the better, even though the world isn't super interested in being changed. So, Chris, thank you for that.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you for listening. So I want to touch on a couple of things there that I think will be really valuable to this audience, because when we think of doing Agile in government, we think about resistance and we think about problems at scale. But I want to hear it from you. You've been doing work for the state of Minnesota lately. What are some of the unique
Yep.
challenges that you found in that experience and the ones prior that large governmental organizations carry?
Yeah, sure. So, and actually it's interesting. I found that in doing both work with state governments as well as some work in my history of working with corporations, one thing that's interesting is that a lot of the same big challenges that people see and are concerned about are very similar across the two. So these, having outdated legacy systems, these command and control hierarchies, lots of bureaucracy that gets in the way of decision making, long planning and funding cycles, siloed teams that end up with order takers as opposed to empowered delivery practitioners. But I think there are a few very unique challenges that are specific to government that create issues that corporations don't have to deal with. One of those is that the impacts are different in how they're handled. There's a lot of talk these days about outcomes, and if you follow someone like Jeff Patton, they have really good content on output versus outcomes and impact, which I think everybody should check out his stuff on that. But if you look at what he's saying there, he's when he describes impact in his content, he's referring mostly to commercial impact. So whether the business is profitable, increasing market share, commercially viable, and it's pretty clear, where everybody wants to be going in those environments. But in government, it's quite different. There are, we often don't have paying customers. In some cases, we're talking about a captive set of people who have really no other choice than to rely on the services that they need from the government. And helping these people actually costs money. So making the experience better for them might mean we spend more money. And now we have this dilemma because there's competing outcomes depending on politics. If is it more important to help people or is it more important to spend fewer dollars? So like if you imagine working at a company and you had, in addition to all the typical stuff you're dealing with, you had half of your leadership that's launching initiatives that are intended to make it harder to buy your products. It's that's something that it feels like often in a government environment.
For an Agile practitioner who is rooted in and interested in helping companies get results faster, some of the challenges that you didn't mention that are under the hood in a governmental organization would be regulation, of course. You mentioned politics, but really, we can't just do things however. There's a strong element of oversight and following the laws and the rules and probably changing in response to changing economic policy, among others. So that creates interesting challenges specifically for Agile practitioners who aren't just trying to get the ball across the goal line. They're trying to do this thing faster, better, with less waste, presumably, is a starting set of principles. What have been some of the interesting challenges in doing Agile in that environment that people who've never worked in government might not know?
Well, I mean, this one's kind of interesting. When I talk a lot of these challenges that are unique in government, I wouldn't say that any of these specifically cause something that's different for Agile practitioners in those spaces than in other spots. And I guess I would say that in my experience, when I'm looking at Agile and its practitioners, and when I say that, I mean people that are bringing like truly the mindset of Agile principles to the table. What I'm encountering is that most of these folks avoid these environments entirely because they just don't support it. And it's for that reason that I don't see many of those folks engage in these contexts. They just don't survive, which is really common feedback I've gotten over the past 10 years when I've been really trying to take this question to the Agile community, saying, hey, we've really got something here that I think could be effective and helpful in some of these more complex government constructs where you have a lot of the things that you just mentioned, the regulation and a lot of those issues. We could apply some of these concepts. And a lot of the main feedback I get is, hey, Kevin, you can't. I don't know why you keep trying. You should stop. Right? Or they'll say things like, you know what, I'm rooting for you. Good luck, man. Let me know when you've found a path that everyone else can follow. And right. So I do think that's one problem that all these issues cause, is that the true concepts of principles of Agile and product just aren't welcome. And a lot of people are saying no thanks, which means we're left mostly with, folks that don't understand the principles or don't mind them throwing them out the window, calling something a product that's not a product, running sprints to write requirements, basically using Agile and product theater and not really, adhering to some of those underpinning principles. And so then the end result of that is a lot of the folks in these environments just end up hating those agile words in general. And so one of the things that I try to do to address that is to apply a lot of the concepts, but not use any of the words.
Rebrand.
And that tends to be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's leads into my next question. You're talking about how are you going to handle that problem? So you mentioned, just to recap, that the Agile principles are not necessarily cherished there, and they may even become a bad word because there's been a lot of friction or maybe bad experiences. So what are you doing then? What's been successful for you that listeners might be able to leverage and try for themselves?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's two answers to this one. One is around like the incremental answer that people could go and try this for themselves, and the other being the transformational answer that is a lot of what I've been working on in terms of putting strategy around how do we shift this entire conversation to be different. And so I guess I can jump in on the incremental answer.
Sure.
Which, this is what I've found, how I've been trying to apply these principles in the way I've interacted. And I mean, I guess the easy way to explain my thoughts on this is be useful, right? Yeah. Become a person that people think of when they need something to get done effectively with a good outcome and without angering everybody. And in these government environments, people like that are fairly rare. So you'll stand out if that's you. And also in a government environment, urgent emergencies can come up quite a bit. And in these emergencies, people are often willing to forgo a lot of that structure that they are comfortable with and willing to grant autonomy to you to get something done if they're backed into a corner and just are out of options. And so that happened to me quite a bit when I spent a lot of time at the state of Iowa, and the PMO lead would come to me and say things like, hey, XYZ team has been working on this for months and hasn't made much progress other than writing requirements, but now we're at a deadline. We need to get something to the legislature in a month, and we're going to come back and show you something in a week and get feedback. Cool. And, at that point, now we're using all of the Agile fundamentals without saying any Agile words and starting to deliver amazing results. And I guess the challenging part about that is, once the emergency is over, the culture starts to just gradually undo some of these behaviors and mindsets that we've instilled because it's what's designed to do. And then we might have, a few people that could keep these things going if they had support, but it's really hard to get it to stick. Like lasting, durable change through that incremental method is not something I've personally been able to make happen, which really takes us to that transformational answer, which is where I've been spending a lot of my time and energy over the last 10 years.
So before you get into it, and I want to hear about it, there's something important in what you just said there. When I'm teaching teams, I frequently refer to the Apollo 13 moment. You ever see that movie?
Yep.
Yeah. So they realize all of a sudden, because the spaceship basically split in half in flight. So they had two different filtration systems, and the one that they're sitting in has the wrong filters for the one that they're sitting in. So they have to radio down and say, we have a problem. We're going to run out of breathable air before we get home. So you see this wonderful scene where everyone just clears the table, and they sit down with all the parts that they know that they have on the shuttle and none of the ones that they don't. And they come up and construct a solution. And then they go test it on the ground before they send the procedure or the protocol back up to space, because they don't want to send them one that doesn't work. But they have all the gear on the ground to test it. So it doesn't work. They reinvent, and then they finally come up with one that works. They upload it, and it saves their lives. Then the panic is over, and we go back to regular mission control, which is kind of like what you just suggested. And
Sure.
The thing that you said that was so revealing was that the minute the emergency's over, nobody wants to let the guardrails down and work like a bunch of high-performance, cross-functional people, experts dedicated to innovating and solving a problem quick. Which begs the question, is it the right move always to try to scale Agile to the whole organization in every situation? Or do you just use it when some kind of urgency demands it? Because to go in and, like you've said, you've had trouble being successful messing up their steady state ops. It's really hard to do. They're going to show up and protest you, right? They're going to lock you at the building. So talk to me about the transformation part, because I want to hear how you would respond to that. Is that maybe the strategy isn't to try to scale it everywhere, at least not at first, but to put it where it's most needed? How does transformation work the way you define it?
I think that's a great point, is that, we can see Agile potentially working in some of these pockets that can't be scaled to the whole organization. But what I think the critical thing that I run into is that even if we have Agile in a smaller sense, we need an organization that can support it, which will often require, in what I've seen, a pretty significant transformation to the organizational ecosystem itself, which really brings us to that transformational answer and has been what I've been trying to explore and trying to figure out ways to accomplish over the last 10 years, really answering this question of what kind of strategy do we need to execute and shift these environments from their current state to one that effectively supports what you're asking about, is having pockets of or some semblance of Agile delivery mechanisms in the environment and providing actual value to taxpayers from an enterprise standpoint. And that overall question is probably not one about agility, but I think the principles are a big part of the answer of how we get from where we're at today to an ecosystem that does support that. And I've spent a lot of time in states building out and testing out strategies for those transformations, accomplishing this as part of Medicaid enterprise systems modernization programs. And recently, Minnesota published their strategy for modernization, which incorporated a lot of these approaches as part of a request for information, asking for feedback from the public and vendor community in general. And that was really cool because, I don't think the response could have been any more positive. The gist of those responses was basically like, oh, holy crap, this is a real strategy for actually doing this. Every state should be looking at this and taking things away to try to shift their organizational ecosystem to something that can support Agile methods.
Right. So tell me, are you willing to tell us about the strategy? Like, how is it different from what they're doing today, what most people might expect or experience?
Yeah, so there's a lot to this. So I'll see if I can do this in a concise way. But I think the fundamental underlying premise of what we're looking at is that the way that states are currently looking at modernizing their systems is resulting in such a poor result that we should almost be doing the opposite of that in most cases, which is, a lot of these Agile practices actually represent the opposite of what's happening today. And it may be helpful to start with, what is the current state and what's typically done, because I don't know that a lot of folks will be familiar with, how large state system implementations go. And there's, for people that are really interested in reading and learning about this, there's a book called Recoding America by Jen Palka, which I think does an amazing job of describing, like, how did we get to the state that we were at today of, the effectiveness of these systems and ecosystems in government. But there's likely, lots of factors that have led to this. But when it comes to these large programs like Medicaid or SNAP or like child welfare, most states are afflicted by just decades of policy change and layered on updates that affect both policy and technology. And a lot of them they still are using the mainframes that were developed in the 80s or 90s and have been building that around them. And legislation that comes through doesn't really focus on removing complexity or removing rules. It just keeps adding over time. So the structures just keep getting more and more siloed, more and more fragmented. Everybody starts buying products and they all do the same thing. And there's money being spent in a lot of different places. So it just gets harder and harder to maintain this. Data's fragmented and people want to fix it, of course, right? So the way that people typically approach this is, seeing the problems and the symptoms that are coming out of the environment, which look to them like, oh, we have a mainframe. Our people are still using this green screen, or, fraud is coming up because we don't have a good understanding or grasp of our data. And the way that the problem solver instinct in all of us wants to address those is by having an easy button solution to that problem. So like, we're still using a mainframe, replace the mainframe, or we don't understand our data. Let's implement a data governance program, whatever that means. And then in government, like, these massive efforts take a really long time to stand up. So we'll spend a couple of years asking for funding to do that. We'll spend a couple of years writing these large procurements to buy someone or a solution to go do it. And we'll spend a couple of years delivering it. And spend no time actually fixing or addressing the actual reasons that we have those problems in the first place. And based on the conversations I've been having with states over the last 10 years, I would say that probably 90% of these either stop before they go anywhere or fail massively. And when it comes to the 10% that make it across the finish line, we're really not hearing from people we're getting the value for the money we're spent. And, we spend a lot of money on this. And so, the prevalent thinking over the last 20 years has been fixing this problem using like enterprise architecture methods or capability maturity models, which in my opinion, just provide like a more structured, more expensive way to step through that failure life cycle. And so, that's a lot of what's typically done. And so just to get into, let's contrast that with the transformation strategy work in the state of Minnesota. I'd say a first difference is the challenges that are targeted by that strategy, with these typical approaches focused on treating those symptoms like the staff using the mainframes. Instead, what Minnesota's put together is looking to really unearth the root cause challenges that are causing those symptoms, and then addressing those using a strategic framework that focuses on that enterprise transformation using more of an end-to-end outcome-driven like use case model to learn about better ways to structure the organization itself with like outcomes and principles as that primary focus. And then really working through a backlog of those end-to-end use cases in more of a discovery mode, allowing the governance, the architecture, the solutions to be more emergent and part of the learning rather than prescribed up front until we've got something that works. And then really pushing these decisions about architecture and governance to the point of execution where this learning is happening. And like you're saying, maybe we can't scale Agile to the organization, but we can create an ecosystem in which the folks can execute following a lot of those principles.
So is it this like a specialized unit where you come to for certain outcomes when you need that pressure to get them done and in market quicker? Or is this, do you sit at the table of an enterprise architecture board, or what's the strategy? It might be best if you can think of one without betraying any confidence or confidentiality. Is there an example of you walk in and everything is siloed and everything is complex and everything takes 3 to 5 years to build, but we want change. We want to do differently. Change is not going to spread through the whole culture overnight, but we could start getting some results in little pockets of high priority or high urgency. Can you walk us through an example of how you found that problem or opportunity, how you addressed it using more agile means and got a result much quicker that made or might make the organization go, oh, we should maybe do more of this?
Well, yeah. So one thing, this is all still being rolled out in a way that we haven't gotten to the execution yet. But the example that Minnesota published as part of their RFI for accomplishing this was starting with picking out an outcome focus area within the enterprise. So they chose new Medicaid enrollment and ongoing benefit maintenance. So basically, making it easier and quicker for someone who's seeking assistance to get and maintain their benefits in that space. And they chose an existing a single first use case of someone seeking Medicare Savings Program assistance, and then published a series of subsequent use cases that could be attacked once that first one met a full definition of done. And the concept there is, not to try to change the existing organization, but to create an incubator discovery mode within which that Medicare Savings Program end-to-end use case could be applied from, the point of someone saying like, I need to apply for this benefit to I'm enrolled, I can get assistance, I can manage it effectively, and doing that in a way where that can be demonstrated and shown without risk to the existing environment and built until a point at which we can expand with other use cases and then start to identify where and when a transition from the current state could be possible. It's more of a transition strategy as opposed to an immediate need fix, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. How do you inspire the people on the teams who are not used to agile ways of working to snap into line and do this? Because they might be thinking, I'm going to lose my job. You're going to get me fired. I'm going to lose my job. How do you change the way that institution thinks? Because there's a cultural thinking to a legacy organization who's done things that way. That's how they got all those silos and all that complexity and all that rigidity. How do you move those hearts and minds, or is that part of it?
No, that's definitely part of it. And I think you've talked about this in the past, I'll get the phrasing wrong, but something to the effect of start with the willing and the minds that fit. You probably can recall it faster than I can, but start with the willing and incubate with a group of people that are 100% bought in, and those will most likely be people that are acknowledging what's happening today is not working for them and are interested in trying something different. Or have seen something that demonstrates that this is something they want to try, and showing a result back and communicating a success back to the organization is critical to continue growing that incubation mode. So we haven't gotten there yet, but I think that's a key part of this is getting an identification of who are those hell yes people who want to try something different and new, and then engaging in that. Another thing that's a little different in state environments is that there are very few, very, very little capacity of people that can execute these transformation types of work. And so what's typically done is states are bringing in these massive vendors to do this. And in this case, there is likely an element of needing to bring in outside expertise to be part of that incubator environment, which is a lot of the strategy work that's been put into what Minnesota's published, because one of those big challenges is procurement takes 2 years. So if procurement takes 2 years, that doesn't work.
Right.
And so we've been spending a lot of time thinking through how do we make procurement take a week? And how do we iterate, and how do we assess and performance manage, which is a little bit of a different beast from how do we execute with an in-house team.
Yes, definitely. And that's when you would get, even if you were working at a bank, people will say, we can do Agile all day long, but I got a vendor here who won't do anything without a 6-week runway, and they want a full spec, right?
Yep.
So what are some... I'm going to back up for a second, come back to this question, because I want to know what are some of the ways that you get vendors on board when they have no motivation really other than their contract to play ball. But when I did some governmental work on and off throughout the years, I remember one of them was for a department of the government that basically made sure people who needed money got it. And they were responsible for enforcing, family obligations, for example. But they wanted to make sure that single parents and kids got the resources they needed. And so every day we would sit down and we would say, okay, we want to do this better, but we can't. Why can't we? Well, because you got to check here and do this, and we have a process for that. Okay, well, why don't we take a moment and remember who we're here for? Because there is a mom out there who's worried that she's not going to be able to feed her kids, and work is hard to find. And even if she could get a job, she can't pay $3,000 a month for daycare. This isn't going to work. She's entitled to this help. She's legally entitled to the help, and she can't get it. How are we going to help her? Because if it's not tomorrow, then it's the next day, but the next day her rent's due, and the next day her kids haven't eaten. So how are we going to fix this problem? That was the attitude that we sat down, we visualized who we were helping, the pain that they were going through, and what would be a bare minimum answer to get her the help that they needed. Do we need people to sit down in front of a bunch of screens and go, oh, look, there's a payment here that's late. We can't have that. Like, can we unlock that payment? Can we do it now? Why is it on hold? Can we clear this block today? I don't care what the solution is. This is a bunch of engineers and astronauts sitting in a room saying, look, we don't fix this. These 3 guys don't come home. And that's not acceptable. It's not even on your radar. So let's get to work. That was kind of the attitude and the spirit that we approached it with. And the people that were selected for that team were, as you said, a coalition of the willing, like people who already wanted to do this kind of work because they could see their end customer. So back to your point, how do we then help? That's easy to do inside an organization, but if you got someone from KPMG or Accenture sitting there outside, they may not get it. They may not want to play ball. How do you handle that?
Yeah, so that was one of the big questions that came up as we were starting to plan this strategic work, which is in many ways very different from the way vendors behave in the space. And so, people were asking the question, would vendors even do this crazy thing? Which was why we put out the RFI, which asked 2 basic questions. 1, what do you think of this strategy? Give us your feedback. And 2, would you do this? Is this something you would be interested in participating in? And, I think given the way the strategy is structured, it resonated very well with the vendors. And I think it's for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. One, the strategy is focused on outcomes instead of just deliver this system no matter what happens, whether it's good or bad. So I think that's appealing to vendors, that they actually get to make a difference, which they're not used to in these environments. Second, it's looking at intentionally clearing away a lot of the red tape and the hurdles that vendors often have to go through, and saying, we're going to give you the autonomy, we're going to give you the empowerment, we're gonna work with you to build this together in a collaborative sense, as opposed to making you an order taker and giving you requirements. So I think that's very appealing to people as well. And so there are lots of questions around how the procurement approach would work, which is a lot of what is going on right now is continuing to have engagement with the mechanics and logistics, and how does payment work, and how do I make sure that we're incentivizing correctly and performance managing correctly. And I've got a lot of content that's out there that would love engagement from everyone that's listening to say, here's some stuff you've put out there that makes sense, here's some stuff that doesn't,
right?
And keep working through it.
I don't know if everyone caught that out there as you're listening to this, but sometimes as Agilists, we feel like we're expected to know all the answers. Like you're not a consultant if you can't come in and say, oh, do this, this, and that. And that leads to the often comical McKinsey report, where there's a whole bunch of recommendations in there that nobody would ever be able to execute. So they don't. They just leave you with the report.
Right.
So what's happening with you is, okay, how are we going to manage vendors differently so that they plug into this kind of initiative and ambition? And your answer is, I don't know. Let's go find out. Why don't we go ask them? Let's start there.
Yep.
And so that's a really important thing that Agilists need to remember, is that you don't need, especially when you're facing a big, challenging problem like this one, you don't need all the answers up front. The framework allows us, the principles allow us to say, I don't know, but we're going to experiment until we figure it out.
You got it. And that's like underpinning this entire strategy is this notion of, when it comes to the solutions, the architecture, the governance, the things that we need, the answer is we don't know, but we're going to create a mechanism by which we can find out, be confident about those things before we invest heavily in big decisions.
Yes.
Which is very different from the way this happens today.
Evidence-based management, empirical learning, those kinds of things that we always talk about, but often don't do well. Let me ask you this. Anyone listening now might be saying, well, this sounds great. I'm going to try this. Willing minds and projects that fit. Let's start there. Let's not worry about having all the answers. Let's acknowledge that this will be complex, but we're going to find a way or make a way. Wonderful. What goes wrong? Let's be brutal and honest. What are the biggest challenges that have been hard for you to address that maybe you're still working on?
Well, yeah. So the challenges in this space are really also the same things that cause the 90% of those efforts to fail that I talked about earlier, that are solution driven. And the strategy tries to call those out and come up with mitigations for them. But I would say that there's two that are primarily in the way at the moment. One being just the something that's transformational really requires the ability and capacity for leadership to commit to and support something that can move forward. And specifically in Minnesota, many might be aware that the state is under a particularly intense set of pressures right now,
yes,
which is putting just everyone in the organization into more of a reactive mode rather than a strategic transformational thinking one.
Right.
So it's possible that something like this might be on a little bit of a hold mode until some of that subsides, or we get to a bigger tipping point of things. So yeah, executive commitment and ability to support, protect, defend, and remove blockers is a really important thing that is tough to get in this space.
I think every Agilist out there would be listening to this and saying, okay, great. How do you get that leadership commitment and support?
Great question. In terms of how we're approaching it, is we keep at it, right? So the RFI was a big step that I think should turn people's heads to say, even though this is very different, it's something that we should be paying attention to and listening to. It was public, so there are legislators out there that are seeing it, are able to watch the videos, are able to read the content, are able to advocate for it. Just being out there and communicating on it, I think is important. And then, just continuing to tell that story as we're working through things that aren't working, and, holding up examples of ways we could try this differently is something we're trying. But again, in a current reactive mode, it's really tough.
And speaking of reactive, something else pops to mind. We're in an age of great technological change, probably one of the biggest technology changes, meaning AI, to really impact us in, I don't know, a couple of decades maybe. And if that's the case, what I talk about these days is the fact that I wouldn't try to solve the AI problem, because we talk about lack of guardrails and lack of consistency and strategy. And those things are all true, but we're really in the gold rush days of AI. It's not going anywhere, but we really haven't figured out the important stuff yet. And when you're in that state, the only thing that's true, the only thing you have to figure out is the fact that it can already do some things faster, which means people are getting prepped around the idea that technology should work for us quickly. Yeah, like it used to be the case that if you, I don't know, sent a request out somewhere to a SaaS system or something like that, maybe you don't get an answer overnight, or you don't get it till the next day. And now everyone's expecting very, very high levels of low latency and immediacy. So one of the things that we need to help when it comes to AI is not knowing the implementation strategy so much as what are you going to do about the fact that people now want things even faster than they did yesterday? So how are all of these rapid changes in tech swarming around you, factoring into this while you wait for some of the political landscapes to calm down and the moment to be right to really, like you had said earlier, we kind of got into the RFI process, but we had to pause it or hold it while we work on the real burning, fire bleeding neck problems. How do you see those kinds of rapid changes in tech factoring into what you're doing?
Well, I definitely think that there, the pace of change right now really only increases the need to figure out different ways to achieve some of this transformation, and is very relevant to the procurement innovation that I talked about that's necessary, right? If we're locked in a 6-year contract for something that was built 6 years previously, it is just very much out of date and something that could be done way more effectively if we had the ability to engage something new and different quickly, which most states currently do not have. And so, being able to take advantage of some of the capability that's coming out, it will be a huge game changer for states. Just looking at the pace of software development is nuts. Not long ago, a non-developer couldn't create any software at all. Today, a non-developer can build and maintain about any isolated capability. And it's, my prediction is, we're 1 or 2 years away from enterprise grade stuff being possible without a huge amount of technical knowledge. Of course, that's always going to be necessary.
Right.
But
or having people clickety clacking keys to comment their code and things that even a developer would say, I don't want to do this anymore.
So fast. The pace that it takes to develop and deploy something that's good and high quality and works very well and can incorporate user feedback because you can show them several options and get their opinions. The pace of being able to do this with software is just exponential right now, and it's really amazing. So I think it's if I'm correct about how fast this is going, which if it stays on the trajectory it's on, we're only a little bit of ways away from, being able to create entire Medicaid enterprise systems very rapidly, or even multiple options of those that could be evaluated as part of transforming from what we have today to something new. And there, a strategy like the one that Minnesota's put out is a way that we could really take advantage of that, and very few are prepared to do it.
I want for people to understand better what it is you've done. Is there a place where they can go and look at what you have built? And, you shared some videos with me, and I was really happy to engage with some of these meetings just out of interest. Is there a place where people can go and look at all this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So the RFI content was all posted on a mural board, which kind of steps through the videos, the documents, the feedback from all the vendors. That's it's an easy place if someone wants to really go deep. People can look at my website, which does have examples of some innovative procurement contracts and RFPs that we've put out there for feedback. And again, interested in anyone's comment and thoughts on anything that's there as well. It is the best way just to give you links and put them in the
Yes,
the
absolutely.
notes.
I'll put them in the show notes. But what I wanted to say is that agilists out there, who are struggling with these problems, government or not, would be really, really interested in hearing how you've managed to overcome them. And what I like about you is that you don't pretend to have all the answers, but you are willing to share what you tried, what worked, and what didn't. I think that's how learn. I think that's how we learn best as agilists, right? Stop pretending that we're some kind of Sherpa on the mountain and we have answers, because when you get into the field, we often don't. And that's okay. As long as we take to heart the principle that failure creates an opportunity to learn and do better. And that's the opportunity most people don't take, but you're doing it. Any last thoughts, Kevin, about, we're in a time where the state of Agile is very much in question. It's shifted. Agile coach, Scrum Master is no longer necessarily even a role, but the duties and the philosophies still remain, even if it's in fragmented format. What is your take on that as your organization is really just starting with agility? A lot of other companies and practitioners are feeling, oh, maybe this is ending. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that also comes back to some of the AI question a little bit. And if I when I look at LinkedIn and a lot of the people that are talking about the end of Agile, what I'm really hearing them talk about is the fact that roles like the Scrum Master role are no longer in demand,
right?
Things like that, and that makes tons of sense to me, because I can now build an entire software product as the user, the developer, the tester, the BA, all things. And so if a Scrum Master role has a big element of it is coordinating lots of people that are need to build that product, and that can all be done now by one person, that role is much less needed.
Yes.
But the principles of Agile still apply in however this software or this environment needs to evolve to take advantage of technology, because it's an emergent thing that we only learn once we try something, and having a mindset where we know the answer up front is not going to serve us well. And so however that turns into roles and things that people need to be employed doing, I think that's going to look extremely different.
Yeah.
But the principles are in my opinion, won't go away, because the problem still exists.
What's interesting is one of the crew in Forge Genesis, which is the entrepreneurial side of what I do, was just saying the other day, all of a sudden, for reasons I can't explain, there's like a resurgence of demand for Agile coaches. Slightly different context. It was more of a hardware kind of implementation as opposed to pure software. But the point is, I don't think the principles are going anywhere. Once we've lifted the curtain and said, we can deliver stuff a lot faster than we are now. And as more eyes are on speed and ROI, a slight shift of focus on our part towards ROI, yes, but most importantly, not ROI in terms of your velocity or how many more stories you can complete in a sprint compared to last sprint. It's more about the ROI for the end user, the stakeholder, the organization.
Yep, outcomes
completely. But one of those outcomes in government, as you mentioned before, is these are people needing services. They need help, right? We're not making widgets. Yeah. We're not making widgets where you can take it or leave it. We've got a system that is put in place to help and serve the people. And if the pace of change raises the bar, then we have to raise ours too. And all of a sudden people are like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have fired all those Agile coaches. I don't know. It might just be a blip. Maybe it was just specific to his company or this moment. But I feel like we might start seeing a demand for some of the great things that we were a little too quick to lay off. We threw a lot of baby out with a little bit of bathwater. My thought.
Yeah,
anyway.
And I think it does depend on the value that those coaches bring. If there's someone that can isolate an outcome, that can mobilize people around achieving that outcome, can show it, demonstrate it, and expand upon it once it's there and get people moving. Yeah, those people are employable at any point, any time, using anything. If it's Agile coaches that are talking about how you should run Scrum ceremonies, unlikely that those coaches, in my opinion, will continue to be employable.
I agree. Kevin, thank you so much for spending time today. I've really enjoyed just getting to know you these past couple of months and learning more about what
Likewise.
You're doing. I think it's fascinating. I hope you keep it up. Any final thoughts before we close?
No, I think we covered it.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Good luck. Good luck with the initiative, man. And thanks for making time to come on the show today. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
I hope you enjoyed that one. I've been talking to Kevin on and off lately, and I've really enjoyed our conversations. And most importantly, you can go and check out his work as he mentioned, and I put the links to those resources in the show notes below. If you'd like to find out more, check him out at worldwideweb.si-delivery.com. I think this stuff is the future of Agile, where the badge doesn't matter, but the work that we do and the change that we make and the value that it delivers still lives on and burns bright. My friend, thank you for joining. I look forward to seeing you next time, and until then, stay badass.